August 30th, 1945. The morning sun over at Tsuji Airfield is obscured by a thick, oppressive haze of humidity and the lingering scent of charcoal. As the wheels of the first C-47 Skitran touch the scorched tarmac, a heavy, unnatural silence hangs over the island of Honshu. There are no cheering crowds, no defiant snipers, and no signs of life, only the rhythmic drone of American radial engines echoing off the empty hangars. Thousands of Japanese soldiers, once the fierce guardians of the Emperor's soil, stand with their backs turned to the landing strips, their weapons surrendered, their faces masks of disciplined shame. Beyond the airfield's perimeter, the civilian world has vanished into the shadows. In the nearby villages, every door is barred with heavy timber, every window is shuttered against the light. Families huddle in the darkness of their cellars, clutching kitchen knives or small vials of potassium cyanide. They are waiting for the arrival of the beasts. For years, the state radio had promised that the American landing would signal the end of the Japanese race, a systematic erasure of their culture, their dignity, and their lives. This was the great silence of a nation that had already accepted its own funeral. The arrival of the 11th Airborne Division was not merely a military occupation. It was a collision of two irreconcilable realities. To the American paratroopers stepping onto the wing flaps, Japan was a mysterious, broken fortress of fanatical mystery. To the Japanese, the paratrooper was a physical manifestation of a demon. In the preceding months, the imperial government had saturated the public consciousness with terrifying imagery. Civilians were told that the Americans would use their tanks to crush the living and their bayonets to sport with the weak. This propaganda served a dual purpose: to maintain a shattered jewel defense where every citizen would die for the throne, and to ensure that no one would ever dare to seek mercy from the Western invader. Consequently, as the first jeeps began to roll toward the outskirts of Yokohama, the Americans found a landscape of ghosts. The streets were so empty that the crunch of gravel under tire treads sounded like thunder. The silence was a weapon of psychological defense, a manifestation of a people who believed they were watching the literal end of the world. This transition from total war to total silence marked the most precarious moment in modern history. The Americans were prepared for a bloodbath, a guerrilla war fought from every doorway and spider hole. Instead, they were met with a paralyzing, tearful dread. The paratroopers moved with their rifles at the ready, scanning the rooftops for the movement that never came. Inside the homes, mothers pressed their hands over the mouths of their infants, fearing that a single cry would draw the wrath of the giants in khaki. The air was thick with the smell of wood smoke and the bitter metallic tang of fear. In this vacuum of information and human contact, the myth of the American demon remained unchallenged. The people of Japan were not merely defeated. They were suspended in a state of mortal terror, waiting for the first blow of an executioner that had just landed on their shores. This was the atmosphere into which the first American boots stepped, a nation trembling so violently that the very foundations of its society seemed ready to shatter before a single word had been exchanged. To understand the depth of this terror, one must look into the architecture of fear constructed by the Japanese military state over the preceding decade. By late 1945, the civilian population had been subjected to a psychological conditioning so total that the line between reality and state mythology had entirely dissolved. This was the 100 million die together ideology, the belief that the preservation of the national soul required the physical destruction of every man, woman, and child. In the classrooms of Tokyo and the rice paddies of Kyushu, the narrative was the same. The Americans were not human beings, but kichikubei, devilish beasts. School children were trained with sharpened bamboo spears, told that even if they could not defeat a soldier, they could die while piercing his heart. This wasn't merely a defense strategy. It was a religious preparation for a national suicide. The historical weight of this moment matters because it represented the collision of two diametrically opposed civilizations. Japan was a society built on the hierarchy of the Shinto state, where the emperor was a living god and surrender was the ultimate spiritual failure. To lose the war was to lose the universe itself. Consequently, the civilians expected the Americans to behave exactly as the Imperial Army had in Nanking or Manila. They anticipated mass executions, the systematic looting of ancestral homes, and the enslavement of the survivors. In the minds of the Japanese public, the new order promised by the Americans was a euphemism for a slaughterhouse. They had seen the firebombing of March 9th, where the sky turned orange and the canals boiled. To them, the men coming out of the Silver Plains were the same harbingers of fire, now arriving to finish the work by hand. This conditioned dread was reinforced by the physical state of the country. Japan was a landscape of ash and starvation. The average daily ration had plummeted to less than 1,000 calories, consisting mostly of sawdust-filled bread or watery gruel. When people looked at the approaching Americans, they saw soldiers who stood nearly a foot taller, fueled by a logistical machine that seemed to defy the laws of physics. The contrast was staggering, a broken, starving population facing a vibrant, well-fed army of giants. This disparity only heightened the sense of otherness. The civilians did not see liberators, they saw apex predators. The terror was so pervasive that even the sight of a GI smiling was interpreted as a sinister sneer, a precursor to violence. Every movement of the occupation forces was scrutinized through a lens of extreme trauma, making the initial silence of the streets not just a sign of defeat, but a collective holding of the national breath before the expected strike. September 1945. The first units of the 11th Airborne and the 27th Infantry Division pushed deeper into the heart of the ruins, moving through the charred skeletal remains of Tokyo and Yokohama. The sound of their boots on the broken glass and ash is the only cadence in a world that has forgotten how to speak. They find families living in dugouts, subterranean burrows carved beneath the rubble of their former lives. When a paratrooper approaches one of these holes, the reaction is primal. Elderly men bow so low their foreheads touch the soot-covered earth, trembling with such intensity that their teeth chatter audibly. Children are pulled back into the shadows, their eyes wide with the expectation of a bayonet. The air is thick with the scent of ozone and the stale, earthy smell of the underground shelters. The emotional contrast of this moment is a study in profound misunderstanding. The Japanese civilians were braced for the rape of the homeland, a violent transition into oblivion. They had heard tales of American soldiers being recruited from prisons and mental asylums, specifically chosen for their bloodlust. Every time a GI reached for his pocket, a civilian braced for a weapon to be drawn. Yet, the historical reality was far different. The American soldier, often a farm boy from the Midwest or a factory hand from the Rust Belt, looked upon the wreckage of Japan not with the fires of vengeance, but with a bewildered, paternalistic pity. They saw not the warriors of the sun, but a starving, destitute people living in conditions that offended their American sense of order and plenty. This first contact was defined by a series of small, unscripted human gestures that the imperial propaganda machine had never accounted for. A soldier from Ohio, seeing a child with protruding ribs and sunken eyes, did not reach for his rifle. Instead, he reached into his webbing and pulled out a small, rectangular object wrapped in brown waxed paper. This was the first appearance of the Hershey's chocolate bar, the symbolic object of American abundance. To the American, it was a common ration, a minor luxury of the mess hall. To the Japanese child, it was an alien artifact, a dense, sweet mystery that smelled of a world they couldn't imagine. The soldier didn't bark an order. He simply knelt, broke off a square, and ate a piece himself to prove it wasn't poison. As the chocolate was handed over, the psychological armor of the Japanese civilian began to crack. The tension did not vanish instantly, but it shifted from the fear of death to a state of profound confusion. Why would a demon share his food? Why would the conqueror, who had the power to destroy, choose to nourish? Factual records from the time describe the Atsugi miracle, where the expected resistance dissolved into a quiet, desperate cooperation. The GIs began to clear rubble from the streets, and the sight of these monsters, performing manual labor to help rebuild the very cities they had helped destroy, was a cognitive dissonance that many Japanese found impossible to reconcile with wartime slogans. The first contact was the beginning of the end for the imperial cult, as the reality of American behavior proved far more potent than the fabrications of the state. October 1945. The logistical might of the United States begins to manifest in the ports of Tokyo Bay with a rhythmic, industrial roar. Massive Liberty ships and Victory vessels disgorge a river of steel and supplies that the Japanese people watch with a mixture of awe and disbelief. While the civilian population had spent years harvesting pine root oil just to keep lanterns lit and scavenging for wild grasses to survive, they now witness a military that moves on a sea of gasoline and refined sugar. The sheer material disparity is not just a tactical advantage, it is a psychological blow that underscores the futility of the war they had been forced to fight. Central to this overwhelming display of wealth is the American ration system, specifically the C ration and K ration, which contain more meat and protein in a single tin than many Japanese families had seen in a year. The chocolate bar, now becoming a ubiquitous sight in the hands of GIs, serves as a silent ambassador of this impossible abundance. It represents a culture that has mastered the Earth's resources to such an extent that even its frontline soldiers are equipped with luxuries. For a Japanese civilian who had been taught that the Americans were a soft, decadent people who would crumble under the spiritual purity of the samurai spirit, the reality is a shocking reversal. The Americans are not soft, they are simply better supplied. Their decadence is actually a terrifying level of industrial productivity. Factual data from the era shows that the United States was producing more calories per soldier than any nation in history, and as these calories began to spill over into the local economy, the Japanese began to realize that their leaders had led them into a war against a literal titan. This abundance acts as a catalyst for a profound transformation in perspective. The Japanese had been told that democracy was a weak, chaotic system that led to poverty and social decay. Yet, before them stood the physical evidence of democracy's success. Healthy, smiling men who had so much food they could afford to give it away to their former enemies. The sight of a soldier casually leaning against a jeep, chewing gum or peeling the wrapper off a Hershey's bar, becomes a more powerful argument for the American way of life than any pamphlet or radio broadcast. It is the peace of plenty. The sound of a crinkling wrapper or the pop of a ration tin becomes a new sensory language of the occupation, replacing the scream of sirens and the whistle of falling bombs. In the bombed-out districts, where the only remaining structures are safes and chimneys, the GIs establish soup kitchens and distribution points. The civilians who once trembled in their shadows now begin to form orderly lines. They observe the soldiers' behavior, the lack of formality, the way they joke with one another, and their refusal to demand the subservient bowing that Japanese officers had required. This casual authority, backed by an endless supply of goods, begins to erode the foundation of the imperial hierarchy. The Japanese people start to see that the demons possess a strange, easygoing humanity. The chocolate bar is no longer just a sweet. It is a symbol of a future where survival is not a desperate struggle, but a guaranteed right under a new, wealthy, and unexpectedly generous order. November 1945. The autumn wind whips through the skeleton of the Ginza district, carrying the fine, gray grit of pulverized concrete. Amidst this desolation, the demon myth begins to collapse not through grand proclamations, but through the mundane reality of human interaction. Groups of GIs, off-duty and wandering the ruins with an easy, rolling gait, encounter Japanese families emerging from their shanties. The emotional contrast is stark. The Japanese expect the cold, calculated violence of a victor. Instead, they meet a casual, almost reckless friendliness. Historical records from the early occupation describe the confusion of Japanese police who observed American soldiers sitting on curbsides, sharing their K-ration crackers with stray dogs and destitute orphans. The beasts of the propaganda posters are nowhere to be found, replaced by young men who seem more interested in finding a souvenir or a hot bath than in committing atrocities. This shift is fueled by the American soldiers' inherent rejection of the rigid, death-obsessed social order they had just defeated. While the Imperial Japanese Army had functioned on a system of brutal corporal punishment and absolute subservience to rank, the GIs display a startling lack of ceremony. They talk back to their sergeants, they laugh loudly in public, and they treat the local population with a mixture of pity and curiosity. For the Japanese civilian, this is a revelation. They witness American officers and enlisted men eating together, a sight that shatters the Japanese concept of a divinely ordained hierarchy. The fraternization that the high command initially tried to limit becomes an unstoppable force of nature. The symbolic Hershey's chocolate bar remains the primary tool of this grassroots diplomacy. Documented accounts tell of candy bar commandos, GIs who carried pockets full of sweets specifically to win over the local children. As a soldier leans out of a slow-moving jeep to hand a silver-wrapped bar to a bowing, terrified boy, the spell of the state-sponsored hatred is broken. The child tastes the sugar, a rare commodity in a nation that had been living on starvation rations for 3 years, and the fear in his eyes is replaced by wonder. This is the soft power of the occupation in its most literal form. The civilian population begins to realize that the Americans do not want their lives. They want their cooperation, and they are willing to pay for it in the currency of kindness and calories. The transformation of perception is rapid and profound. In the bathhouses and the few surviving markets, whispers spread that the Americans are human after all. The GIs start showing photos of their families, wives in floral dresses, clapboard houses with white fences, and dogs on green lawns. These images of a distant, peaceful prosperity act as a window into a world the Japanese had been told was crumbling. Instead of a decadent wasteland, they see a society of immense warmth and stability. By the end of 1945, the trembling has largely stopped, replaced by a cautious, wide-eyed observation of these strange, wealthy men who seem to carry the spirit of a new age in their pockets. December 1945. As the winter chill settles over the jagged skyline of Tokyo, a specific and profound shift occurs within the most vulnerable segment of the population. For Japanese women, the arrival of the Americans had been prefaced by state-sanctioned warnings of systemic brutality and the total collapse of feminine dignity. They had been told to cut their hair, smudge their faces with ash, and wear baggy momp trousers to hide their forms from the foreign devils. In the first weeks, many stayed indoors, peering through cracked shutters at the passing patrols. However, the historical reality of the occupation began to diverge sharply from these nightmares. They observed, with cautious bewilderment, as American GIs stepped off sidewalks to let Japanese women pass or offered a hand to elderly grandmothers struggling with heavy bundles of firewood. This display of casual chivalry was a sensory and social shock. In the rigid Confucian hierarchy of wartime Japan, women were often relegated to a status of quiet subservience, rarely receiving such overt gestures of respect from men, let alone from an occupying army. Documented accounts from the period highlight the confusion of Japanese women who saw American soldiers showing them photographs of their own wives and daughters back in the States, women who looked happy, empowered, and safe. The emotional contrast was overwhelming. The beasts were, in fact, men who seemed to miss their own homes and respected the sanctity of the family unit. The fear of violence began to melt into a quiet, observant curiosity about a culture that treated its women with such visible, public consideration. The recurring symbol of American abundance, the Hershey's chocolate bar, played a critical role in this domestic diplomacy. It was often through the children that the women first engaged with the soldiers. A mother, watching from a distance as a GI knelt in the dirt to share a sweet with her son, saw a rejection of the demon myth more powerful than any political speech. The chocolate was a luxury that bypassed language barriers. Its sweetness was an undeniable truth in a world of bitter deprivation. Factual records indicate that as trust grew, Japanese women began to emerge in brighter colors, reclaiming a sense of self that had been suppressed by the austerity of the war years. This transformation was not merely about safety, but about the perception of a different way of life. The sight of American nurses in uniform or WACs performing administrative duties with authority challenged the traditional Japanese view of gender roles. The Japanese woman began to see that the American way offered a level of individual agency that the imperial system had denied them. By the end of the year, the trembling had been replaced by a tentative but firm sense of security. The presence of the U.S. troops, once feared as a source of certain destruction, had instead created a strange, protected space where the reconstruction of the Japanese family and the Japanese identity could begin in earnest. The chocolate bar, once a bribe for safety, had become a gift of friendship. January 1946. The transition from enemies to neighbors begins to solidify under the gray, winter skies of the Kanto Plain. The American military presence, once an abstract terror, has become a functional part of the Japanese landscape. The rhythmic chugging of M32 recovery vehicles and the high-pitched whine of Willis jeeps replace the silence of the ruins. In the shattered remains of Tokyo's suburbs, a new social contract is being written in the dirt. American GIs, setting aside their rifles for shovels, join work details to clear the mountains of debris that choke the narrow streets. The sight of a victor performing manual labor to restore the infrastructure of the vanquished is a profound historical anomaly that shatters the last remnants of the imperial caste system. The logistical integration of the occupation brings a strange, industrial comfort to the civilian population. Factual records from this period describe the Jeep economy, where the arrival of a single American vehicle in a village signaled a sudden influx of resources. The GIs, moved by the destitution of the families living in corrugated iron shacks, began to informally divert supplies from their own overflowing stocks. It was not uncommon to see a 10-carat gold wedding ring traded for a single carton of Lucky's or a few tins of evaporated milk, but more often, the exchange was a one-way act of charity. The Americans possessed a surplus of everything: fuel, medicine, and hope, and the Japanese, who had been stripped of all three, began to lean into this abundance with a desperate, growing trust. The recurring symbol of this new era, the Hershey's chocolate bar, undergoes its own transformation. It is no longer an object of suspicion or a bribe for safety. It has become a staple of the new childhood. In the scorched parks where children once practiced bayonet drills with bamboo sticks, they now congregate around parked jeeps. The sound of a crinkling silver wrapper is met with cheers rather than cowering. These chocolate orphans, as some historians would later call them, become the primary bridge between the two cultures. They learn broken English phrases, "Hello, give me chocolate," and in return, the GIs learn the names of the local families. This interaction creates a layer of human protection that no official policy could enforce. By early 1946, the transformation of the Japanese psyche is visible in the very posture of the people. The deep, fearful bows of August have softened into polite nods and occasional smiles. The civilians no longer flee when a patrol rounds a corner. Instead, they continue their work, perhaps pausing to watch the Americans with a curious, analytical gaze. They see a military that, despite its overwhelming power, operates with a casual, egalitarian efficiency. The GIs don't demand the sidewalk, they share it. They don't commandeer the last scraps of food, they bring more. This logistical reality provides a more convincing argument for the benefits of the new administration than any radio broadcast from General MacArthur's headquarters. The demon has not only been humanized, he has become the neighbor who holds the keys to the warehouse of the future. February 1946. Beneath the skeletal remains of the Mitsubishi buildings in Marunouchi, a deeper psychological pivot begins to take hold of the Japanese collective consciousness. The democracy, being imported by the Americans, is not being learned from the translated textbooks or the loudspeaker proclamations of the Supreme Command for the Allied Powers. It is being observed in the dirt. The Japanese civilian, raised in a culture of rigid verticality where one's status was defined by the depth of a bow, watches the American GI with a mixture of confusion and burgeoning envy. They see a private talk back to a captain with a casual "yes, sir," and a shrug, or a sergeant sharing a cigarette with a corporal as equals. This egalitarian spirit, the idea that a man's worth is not dictated by his bloodline or his proximity to the emperor, becomes the most subversive force in the occupation. The historical evidence of this shift is found in the changing social landscape of the urban ruins. The daimyo complex of the Japanese military, which demanded total subservience from the common people, is replaced by the approachable authority of the American shore patrol and infantry. The GIs do not walk with the stiff, choreographed aggression of the Imperial Guards. They lean against walls, they sit on the bumpers of their jeeps, and they whistle as they work. To the Japanese observer, this lack of posturing is not a sign of weakness, as the propaganda had suggested, but a sign of immense, quiet confidence. They begin to realize that the Americans do not need to demand respect through fear because they possess a different kind of power, an individual agency that the Japanese state had systematically suppressed for decades. The recurring symbol of American abundance, the Hershey's chocolate bar, serves as the physical manifestation of this democratic ideal. In a society where the best resources were always reserved for the elite, the sight of a common American soldier possessing, and then casually giving away, high-quality sweets is a revolutionary act. It suggests a society where the common man is entitled to the luxuries of life. The chocolate bar is the everyman's treasure, a mass-produced piece of happiness that reinforces the American promise, that hard work and a free system lead to a life of plenty for everyone, not just the chosen few. This realization begins to dismantle the spiritual foundation of the old regime more effectively than any purge of government officials. By late winter, the Japanese perception of the American way has shifted from a fear of chaos to a desire for participation. The civilians start to mimic the Gi's relaxed posture and their direct way of speaking. The trembling that defined the first encounters has been replaced by an analytical, almost hungry observation of how these free men conduct themselves. They see that the Americans are not bound by the same invisible chains of shame and obligation that have defined Japanese life for centuries. This psychological pivot marks the true end of the war. The Japanese people are no longer just surviving an occupation. They are beginning to audition for a role in a new, democratic world where the sweetness of life is no longer a forbidden dream, but a tangible reality wrapped in silver foil. March 1946. As the first cherry blossoms begin to bud against a backdrop of twisted steel and scorched timber, the landscape of recovery takes on a frantic, vibrant energy. The Japanese people, once paralyzed by the expectation of their own extinction, are now fully engaged in the messy, industrious business of rebirth. The streets of Tokyo and Osaka, once silent corridors of ash, are now teeming with a chaotic mixture of olive-drab jeeps and hand-drawn carts. Black markets, or blue sky markets, have evolved into essential hubs of the new economy, where the remnants of the old world are bartered for the abundance of the new. In these crowded alleyways, former soldiers of the emperor, still wearing their tattered mustard-colored uniforms with the insignia stripped away, stand shoulder to shoulder with American GIs. They are no longer locked in a struggle for territory, but in a pragmatic exchange of goods and survival. The transformation is evidenced by the disappearance of the barrier between the occupier and the occupied. Factual records of the era note a staggering increase in informal labor, where Japanese civilians were hired to assist in the massive rebuilding of airfields, barracks, and administrative offices. The sight of a former Japanese lieutenant working under the direction of an American corporal, not as a slave, but as a paid laborer, marks the total inversion of the previous social order. The fear has been replaced by an exhausting, hopeful labor. The Japanese have witnessed the American machine not just destroy, but create. They see the power of bulldozers and the efficiency of prefabricated housing. This physical reconstruction of their cities serves as a metaphor for the reconstruction of their ideology. They are learning that the American demon is a builder, a provider, and a remarkably consistent administrator who pays in a currency that can actually buy rice and medicine. The Hershey's chocolate bar, once a rare and terrifying gift, has now become the unofficial currency of this burgeoning peace. It is the common denominator in a world of complex shifts. A GI might trade a bar for a hand-painted fan or a piece of silk, but more often, it is simply the lubricant of social interaction. The children who once hid in cellars now run alongside the American trucks with a practiced, joyful persistence. The sound of the American abundance is no longer the roar of AB 29, but the laughter of children with chocolate-smudged faces. This simple luxury represents the first taste of a world where the struggle is not for the next breath, but for a better quality of life. By the spring of 1946, the ideological transition is nearly complete. The civilian population has moved through the stages of terror, confusion, and observation to arrive at a state of active participation. They have seen that the American presence provides a stability that their own military could not maintain. The GIs, with their casual demeanor and their pockets full of candy, have humanized the concept of democracy more effectively than any constitutional reform could. The trembling has been consigned to the past, a dark memory of a war that ended not with a whimper of defeat, but with the startling, sweet realization that the enemy was human, and that the future, though difficult, was finally something they could see. The cherry blossoms of 1946 fall upon a land that is no longer a fortress of shadows, but a theater of reconstruction. The transition is complete. The Japanese people, who months earlier stood on the precipice of a national suicide, now walk the streets with a steady, quiet purpose. They have witnessed a historical phenomenon that defies the typical cruelty of conquest. The demons from the West did not come to harvest souls. They came with bulldozers, penicillin, and an almost reckless generosity. The fear that once constricted the throats of millions has evaporated, replaced by the mundane, beautiful reality of daily survival. In the silence that followed the greatest conflict in human history, a new truth was whispered, that the strength of a nation is measured not by the fear it inspires, but by the abundance it is willing to share. This transformation of the Japanese psyche remains one of the most significant shifts in the history of modern warfare. It was a victory won not by the bayonet, but by the behavior of the common American soldier. The historical record shows that when faced with a choice between the dark, suicidal honor of the past and the vibrant, messy freedom of the future, the people chose the light. They chose the world represented by the GIs who shared their cigarettes and showed photos of their sweethearts. The rigid, vertical world of the emperor had been flattened by the horizontal, egalitarian spirit of democracy. This was the Atsugi miracle, the moment a nation realized that its enemy was not a beast, but a brother from a different shore, carrying the tools of a better civilization in his webbing. The Hershey's chocolate bar, that small rectangle of silver and brown, remains the enduring symbol of this encounter. It was the first bridge across a chasm of hatred. To the American, it was a mere ration. To the Japanese, it was a taste of a world where scarcity was an anomaly and kindness was a default. It represented the triumph of American democracy, a system that could produce enough sweetness to feed its soldiers and still have plenty left for the children of its enemies. The sound of a wrapper crinkling in a Tokyo alleyway became the first note in a new anthem of cooperation. It was a tangible proof that freedom does not just offer liberty. It offers life in all its caloric and compassionate glory. In the final reflection, the occupation of Japan serves as a poetic testament to the power of human connection over the poison of propaganda. It teaches that even the most deeply ingrained ideologies can be dismantled by the simple, repeated act of human decency. The civilians who once trembled at the approach of a jeep eventually learned to wave at the men inside, realizing that the greatest weapon in the American arsenal was not the atomic bomb, but the hand that reached out to offer a sweet to a hungry child. Freedom, in its truest sense, is the ability to look at a former enemy and see a neighbor. As the sun sets over a rebuilding Japan, the shadows of the beasts have vanished, leaving behind a nation that found its way back to the light through the unexpected, sugar-coated grace of its conquerors.